Good morning, everyone. I think we should actually get started because we are going to be pressed for time with this exciting panel coming up. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and Ngunnawal people, past, present and future, and welcome all your guests to coming to this labour mobility session. I'm going to introduce you to our panellists in order of presentation. First, we've got Jane Baston-Secomete. Jane is a Director of Pacific Labour Mobility with DFAT, and she's had a range of international and domestic program and policy experiencing spanning Australian regional, community and international development. And from 2014 to 17, Jane was the first Secretary Education and Australian High Com in the Solomon Islands. In Canberra, Jane has held positions in education policy in the PNG branch. Prior to joining the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, she worked on Australian Indigenous programs and policy, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts from the ANU. Following Jane will be a presentation by Julie Wearyman. Unfortunately, you're going to hear me twice. Julie has lost her voice, but it's work that Julie and I have done together. Julie is a Senior Labour Officer for the Employment Service Unit at the Department of Labour in Vanuatu. And she's also the Employment Service is the unit that regulates labour mobility for both RSC and SWP programs. And following Julie will be Dr. Stephen Howes. He's a Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the ANU. He's the Director of DevPol and has served as the Director of the International and Development Economics Program at the Crawford School from 2009 to 2014. Prior to joining the Crawford School in 2009, Stephen was Chief Economist at the Australian Agency for International Development. He worked from 1994 to 2005 at the World Bank. And then there'll be myself. I'm Dr. Michelle Bailey, and I've been a research fellow here at the ANU for the past 3.5 years, and I have been researching both RSC and SWP for the last 11 years now. But due to time restrictions, we'll get started, and I'd like you all to welcome Jane to the podium.
I'd also like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we meet on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, and acknowledge their continuing connection to Australia's lands and waters. Michelle, thank you for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today. It's wonderful to be here with so many people from the Pacific and of the Pacific, and with people with a great interest and connection to the Pacific. As someone myself with a strong background and personal connection and with Pacific heritage, I'm really delighted to participate today. So today, as Rochelle has outlined, we're considering Pacific labour mobility in terms of learning from the past and looking to the future, which is really relevant, I think, given Australia's current position on labour mobility and coming out of the presentations that we had this morning from the Foreign Minister and from Dame Meg. So my contribution this morning will be to talk about Australia's increased support for labour mobility, and in particular to talk about the new Pacific Labour Scheme, the Pacific Labour Facility, and also the connection to the Australian Pacific Training Coalition, APTC3. So I think Julie and Rochelle and Stephen will no doubt have much more to share than me, I think, in terms of learnings and insights into both the past and the future in terms of labour mobility. However, I think the questions about what have we learnt from the past and what are our insights and how are we looking to the future in labour mobility are critical questions that we all need to be considering. So those of us who are government officials, both in Australia and the Pacific, researchers, academics, industry and business representatives who have a vested interest in labour mobility in Australia, and the community, both in Australia and in the Pacific. I think they're questions that we all need to keep considering. Also, I think it came out this morning, the idea of partnership and how we sort of engage in a closer dialogue, and I think that's also critical because while we have elements of labour mobility that affect Australia and also the Pacific, I think we also need to be very mindful of the partnership and the connection. Today's discussion is a really important opportunity, I think, for all of us to come together, given the context and the time. So that's a bit of an outline. I think I've already gone through that, what I'll talk about today. I'll start by talking about what grounds Australia's support for labour mobility right now. So following on from the Minister's speech this morning, one of the highest priorities of the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper is Australia's strong engagement in the Pacific. It commits us to engaging with the Pacific with intensity and ambition to deliver innovative policy and substantial investments in the region's development. So the White Paper sets out the importance of promoting economic cooperation and greater integration within the region and with Australia and New Zealand as being vital to the economic prospects of the Pacific. So in that context, Australia has committed to work to improve opportunities for growth and jobs and to strengthen the economic resilience of the region by increasing opportunities for labour mobility. So labour mobility really is central to Australia's economic cooperation with the Pacific. The approach will include focusing on investing in skills, which I'll come to in more detail later when I talk about APTC3 and the connections with the Pacific Labour Scheme, and helping Pacific countries capture potential in sectors relevant to economic growth, which I think goes to the nature of the way that we're viewing labour mobility as circular. So what happens in Australia is important, but also the development impacts in the Pacific is also important and part of the way that we're considering labour mobility. So the transformative potential of labour mobility, I think, has been spoken about, particularly in the launch of the new Pacific Labour Scheme. And I think it's important to remember that there are two challenges that we're trying to address, both through the new schemes but also previously through the seasonal worker program. So it's about opportunities for development in the Pacific, but it is also about helping Australian businesses fill workforce gaps. And that's perhaps one of the unique parts of this kind of program that's different to other aspects of Australia's development program. And we've very much got those two objectives that focus both on supporting Australian businesses within Australia as well as development in the Pacific. So the matching of Pacific workers who have limited opportunity for work in their own country with the labour market demand in some sectors in Australia is considered a triple win. Triple because the benefits are transformational and go beyond just the individual worker and the Australian employer. So families, communities and economies benefit from the increased income and skills. So the benefits are, there can be a catalytic effect, and hopefully Rochelle will talk about that, I think, a little bit later. And I think that's true for both the Pacific but also for the Australian communities and economies that participate. So in addition to the mutual benefit, I think the people-to-people links can't be underestimated. I know since being in this role, I've certainly heard many stories of the connections between Pacific workers and Australian employers and communities. I think that's another important part of the programs that we shouldn't underestimate. And I know myself from having lived and worked in the Pacific that the impact of professional and personal connections can really be quite remarkable. And I think for all of us in the region, a deeper personal understanding of our neighbours is highly valued. So in terms of Australia's labour mobility initiatives, we now have a number of labour mobility initiatives. Some of them will be familiar to you and some of them are newer. So currently we have the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme, both predated by pilot programs, and they also both include programs of support and services to support those programs. So both the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme include temporary entry visas, which are a critical component of the way that the programs and schemes work. But I can't emphasise enough that they include much more than the visas that enable work. So they include systems and services that support workers, and through the aid program support that is aimed at improving the performance of labour market systems. So both components of support to workers and for Pacific Island countries' own labour market system reform and strengthening will continue to be important, I think, as labour migration to both Australia and New Zealand grows. The components of additional support are critical for protecting both Pacific workers and also Australian jobs. So now a bit of background on the seasonal worker program, and that program is probably known to many of you. And I need to acknowledge that while the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has a long-term interest and supports the seasonal worker program, the seasonal worker program is actually managed by the Department of Jobs and Small Business. It's a program that has grown and settled since the pilot that started it in 2008. I don't think that was me. I understand that the program has grown on an average of 29% year on year, so it's had substantial growth and change over that period. Since 2012, over 25,000 visas have been issued under the program, and a recent World Bank report tells us that the program has delivered approximately $144 million in net income gains to the region since 2012. On average, seasonal worker program workers save and send home just over $8,850 per placement. And for the countries who send large numbers of workers to Australia, those aggregate income gains are quite significant. So I mentioned earlier that these programs are more than visa programs and that they include support roles. And the Labour Mobility Assistance Program is one of those components of support. So DFAT manage what we call LMAP, and it supports the Pacific countries participating in the seasonal worker program to increase the number and quality of workers they're sending to Australia and to increase the benefits to workers and communities through their participation in the program. The other important part of LMAP is that it has helped us build an evidence base to inform the policy and the program outcomes. And it supported labour sending units based on their needs and capacities. I understand that some of the lessons learned through LMAP include the really important need to tailor support to each country based on need and capacity, which I think most of us in development will know is critical. And also that the necessary cooperation between Australian government, because there are a number of Australian government agencies involved in the program, and also the importance of cooperation with New Zealand and their RSE program. I think that's particularly true in Pacific countries who, I think it's easy to be in Canberra and perhaps, forget what's happening outside. But for labour sending units that are often very small, I think the engagement between Australia and New Zealand is critical. A little bit about the Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program. So this was a program managed by DFAT, which is different to a Northern Australia program that was managed by Department of Jobs. So this is the program that was a pilot that predated the new Pacific Labour Scheme. It started with Kiribati, Nauru and Tuvalu, and it was really it did set up the conditions for what we see in the Pacific Labour Scheme today. So it was longer visas in non-seasonal work for up to 3 years. And it was a commitment that came through under the Northern Australia White Paper. The Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program demonstrated success as a model for longer-term, non-seasonal temporary employment opportunities for Pacific workers, and especially women. I think particularly because of the sectors that it was working in, it was particularly valuable in terms of the higher participation rates of women under that program. The Pastoral Care Support Services program is particularly important because it was a successful model for supporting the workers who came under the Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program. And the intention was to give workers every chance of success in their transition to employment in Australia. So services included the period from pre-mobilisation, while workers were still at home, through to transition to life and the workplace in Australia. And the program also focused on employer engagement with workers and their home countries. And I think that was also a critical role that we found that the program played in making sure that that communication and connection between employers and workers was as good as it could be. And so this program of support will be incorporated into the Pacific Labour Facility, and I'll talk about that a little bit later through a staged approach. So that brings us to the Pacific Labour Scheme, the new scheme that was announced and commenced on the 1st of July this year. So the Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program grandfathered into the PLS, so it's now finished and has now become part of the PLS. The first countries to join the PLS were Kiribati, Nauru and Tuvalu, the same countries who were working on that pilot. The key features of the Pacific Labour Scheme are the 3-year employment visas, so it's between 12 months and up to 3 years. And the other difference from the seasonal worker program is that it focuses on low and semi-skilled work. The focus sectors are hospitality, tourism, aged and disability care and non-seasonal agriculture and fisheries. It's defect-led and managed, and the scheme contains safeguards to protect workers. So we've got this nice photo just from last week, which was the ceremony that the Minister mentioned this morning. So the signing of MOUs with Samoa, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. So we've got the new Pacific Labour Scheme that started in July, and we will have a Pacific Labour Facility. And the Pacific Labour Facility will support the operation of the scheme. So in terms of timing, the facility hasn't started yet, but we expect that it will start in October, following a consultative design process and competitive tender. So the design process has been finished and the tender is currently underway, and we expect the contract will begin in October. So currently the Labour Mobility Assistance Program that's provided the Pacific side of support for the seasonal worker program and the pastoral care support that we've had for the Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program are both still operational, but their functions will both transfer to the facility when it begins in October. So the facility will connect Australian employers with Pacific workers and support the administration of the scheme. And it will also provide, as I've said, the support that LMAP was previously providing. So it'll provide targeted support to the seasonal worker program as well. The outcomes for the facility focus on what happens in Pacific countries, what's happening with Australian employers, and also they'll look to the regulation and management of circular labour mobility between Australia and the Pacific. The facility will also look to the social and economic impacts of circular labour mobility, which I think is an important commitment given that we are expanding our engagement in labour mobility. I think it's great that there's been a commitment up front to look to research and understand the social and economic impacts of labour mobility as we move forward. So there are a number of other programs, both Pacific regional programs and bilateral programs that the Australian Government already supports through our development program. And labour mobility can be strengthened by close engagement and collaboration with those programs. There's a number of programs that strengthen private sector growth, enable human development and strengthen governance. And it'll be really important that our programs work in cooperation with those programs. So the Australian Pacific Training Coalition, APTC3, is one such program that has a direct overlap with supporting labour mobility. So many of you will be familiar with the APTC, and it was established in 2007 as the Australian Pacific Technical College and is now transformed to the Australian Pacific Training Coalition, which better reflects the organisation's operations and the importance of local partnerships. The APTC is a success story, having delivered 12,000 graduates with Australian level qualifications across 5 Pacific campuses. And the APTC has been a flagship education and skills investment in the Pacific for Australia. The new phase will continue to deliver Australian standard qualifications to graduates, but it will include a greater focus on increasing opportunities for labour mobility for APTC graduates. And it'll also include a greater focus on working with Pacific TVET systems through partnerships and coalitions that are focused on reform. Gradually introducing co-investment, including by individuals, employers and governments, both in kind and financial. So paired with the new Pacific Labour Scheme and the Pacific Labour Facility, it will play a key role in skilling up Pacific Islanders to meet the demands of both local and regional labour markets, including in Australia. The match between the Pacific's demand for skilled workers and Australia's value add as a world leader in TVET, I think, has been part of the APTC's success. And the fact that that success is of and from the Pacific, I think, is wonderful. So you may have heard these APTC stats before, but I think that they're worth repeating. So when the APTC began in 2007, about 20% of the employees were Pacific Islanders, and today 80% of the trainers are Pacific Islanders. And I think that's an outcome that we should all celebrate. The links between APTC3 and the Pacific Labour Scheme and Facility are logical. The APTC3 and Pacific Labour Facility will work very closely to harmonise effort and delivery for both Pacific and Australian labour markets. And while the links are logical, I'd like to emphasise that both schemes have actually been designed to work together, so they will work closely. So the APTC will have two tracks. It'll have a domestic and an international track to meet the needs of employers, industry and workers. APTC3 will support workers with qualifications needed for Pacific Labour Scheme opportunities while maintaining a focus on domestic needs. So APTC3 must deliver a net skills gain for the Pacific, and so it will need to effectively service the needs of Pacific labour markets through supporting local reform and helping facilitate increased graduate mobility. And I think skills development is an issue that isn't confined to education and training, and similarly I think is very much a part of the sort of labour mobility workforce strategy. So I think it's exciting that the two will work together, and I think already through some of the success of graduate placements and recruitment, we've seen that link between local training institutions and employment opportunities in Australia. So it's exciting that I think that will continue. Gender equality and disability inclusion are both important objectives of the Australian aid program and cross-cutting issues that we always consider in our programs, and labour mobility is no different. So when the facility commences, a gender and disability inclusion strategy will be a priority, and it's also been part of the consideration of the design. We will actively work to increase women's participation in the scheme and also in the broader Pacific labour market system as well. So what will this look like? Australia and Pacific Island countries will need to discuss policies and practices, if they aren't already, in relation to women's participation in the labour force. Training, mentoring and ongoing support for Australian employers, labour sending units, agents and all other key actors in the selection and recruitment processes to raise awareness of the importance of the benefits of women's participation and to develop and implement strategies to increase their participation. So in Australia, promote recruitment of women amongst Australian employers, identify relevant, practical and accessible training opportunities for women, and strategies to address any vulnerabilities that women may face once they are in the workforce. An approach to gender must also include consideration of the impact on both men and women, both in participation of the workforce, but also in terms of what happens for people who remain at home. So there may also be social impacts for people who aren't participating in the scheme but their family member is. So that also needs to be a consideration. Practical options might include involving whole families in financial planning, in goal setting and skills building, and at critical times of both pre-departure but also at reintegration when workers are returning home. And it will be important to monitor the social and economic impacts for both men and women in Australia and Pacific Island countries and communities. So I think that will be important as we, as labour mobility is implemented, that we monitor that social and economic impact. So a bit of a slide here on the success to date of Pacific workers. So we know from experience in the seasonal worker program that Pacific workers are highly productive and reliable during peak periods in terms of the needs of Australian businesses. And productivity under the seasonal worker program was on average 20% higher than that of working holiday makers. So we know that seasonal workers work for employers for much longer periods than work on holiday makers. And when seasonal workers return to their employer, they're a further 15% more productive. So in terms of the Pacific Labour Scheme, looking forward for employers, the key benefits of the scheme will be access to a stable and reliable workforce when Australian workers are not available. Workers can remain in Australia for up to 3 years, and many will hold Australian level qualifications. So whether that's through previous training that they've done through the APTC, or whether it's training that they do as preparation to participate in the scheme. Pastoral care and support will be provided through the scheme's Pacific Labour Facility. So in terms of employer responsibility, so approved employers who will participate in the scheme, they need to operate in rural or regional Australia. So there is a location requirement as part of the scheme, but it's targeted at rural and regional Australia, so it's not for capital cities. They'll need to meet approved employer guidelines and register as a temporary activity sponsor with the Department of Home Affairs. So they'll be working through an approval process that will involve a number of Australian government departments. So it'll involve Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Department of Home Affairs, and also the Fair Work Ombudsman. A critical point is that they will need to demonstrate that no Australian workers are available to fill vacancies. So that's a critical part of the scheme in terms of protecting Australian jobs. So it will only be when there's been a demonstrated evidence that the position has been advertised and they haven't been able to fill it with Australian workers. They'll need to abide by occupation relevant Australian workplace conditions. So I think it's also really important to emphasise that all workers under the scheme share the same entitlements and protections as Australian workers. And that applies for both the seasonal worker program and the new Pacific Labour Scheme. So in terms of employee responsibilities, employees also need to abide by all Australian laws, including workplace legislation, and they will need to remain with a Pacific Labour Scheme approved employer for the duration of their visa. So the visa is a sponsored visa, so people will need to remain with their place of employment and obviously return home at the end of their deployment because it is a temporary entry visa, even though it's extended for the 3-year period. So just to finish in conclusion, I thought I'd come back to a photo from an earlier slide because I think it's a kind of real story of what we've been talking about today. So this photo is of an award ceremony that was held on Hayman Island at the beginning of the year for Kiribati workers who completed their Certificate 3 in hospitality. So Malfa, who managed the resort on Hayman Island, were the first employer to participate in the Northern Australia Worker Pilot Program. They'll also participate in the Pacific Labour Scheme. Many of these workers had prior experience in the sector, but this was part of the formal qualification that they gained as part of their participation. So I think anyone who's ever attended a graduation ceremony such as this, I think this is quite a small one, but they'll know what a milestone it is, I think, to sort of celebrate both the achievement of the hard work to have gained the qualification, but also in terms of the kind of opportunities that, to come through having gained that qualification. And so I think this is what we look forward to through, increased labour mobility, that there were many more milestones for many more people from the Pacific, celebrating those alongside Australian businesses and industry. So just to finish off, if I come back to the questions that I raised earlier on about what have we learnt from the past and how are we looking to the future, I think I'd like to say that we know that Pacific labour mobility can be transformational. I think we know that, and we've probably moved beyond that now. And now the focus should be on what works best and how we can do it well. So what works best for Australian employers and what works best for Pacific workers now needs to be the focus. We need to continue to focus on the mutual benefits for Australia and the Pacific. And we need to maintain a focus on providing support and protection for workers. And we need to continue a strong regional and partnership approach that strengthens labour market systems in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jane, but I think because of a bit of a late start to the session, we just take 2 questions for now, and hopefully if we have time at the end of all the sessions, we'll take some more. 2 short questions, preferably. Stephen?
Yeah, just 2 very brief questions. Sorry, 1, 2. No, in New Zealand, where I come from, there's been some reaction against Pacific labour mobility for a number of reasons. One is that the idea of using cheap labour from the Pacific to sustain an economy, and for jobs which New Zealanders themselves don't want to do, like picking apples and all those things. So the matter of dignity, of course, the power relationship in terms of who has the power to get someone to do something. And secondly is the APTC, for instance, by creating the skill, which is great. I mean, there's a lot of benefits in terms of money going back in relation to the labour mobility, for instance, to communities within the Pacific. The APTC also has been seen as a means of getting, the skilled people from the Pacific to migrate, and thus creating this, the need for skill. I mean, in Fiji, for instance, they're running out of skilled people, and as a result of people migrating, the skills, a lot of them trained through the APTC program. I wonder if you can respond to that.
Yeah, sure, I'll try. So I think to your first question, I guess my response would be that I think Pacific workers who are coming to work in Australia, in terms of wages, are entitled to the same wages that an Australian would be for doing the same work. I mean, I think the question of why Australian workers perhaps aren't doing these jobs is a bigger question that I can't answer. But in terms of wages, the fact that Pacific workers are paying the same as an Australian would be paying for the same jobs, I think is really important. So I guess that's my response to the first question. And I think the second one, in terms of the brain drain, I guess for want of a better word, is a genuine consideration for both Pacific Island countries and Australia. So I think that's why, in terms of our design, the concept is around circular labour migration. So it really is about not just what workers can provide while they're here for the duration of their employment in Australia, but it is about the longer term benefits to them as workers, to the economies, to the countries that they're coming from. So in terms of planning, in terms of the training, the sectors that are focused on, and the opportunities for people to either use the skills that they gain while they're in Australia when they return home, or to use their remittances and savings to take up other business opportunities or progress other opportunities at home, I think will be an important part of the consideration. And we are doing this, I guess, through MOUs with governments in the Pacific, and so I think those kinds of questions around governance and planning will be really important, I think, to continue in terms of how the scheme will work best for the longer term interests of the participants and the Pacific Island countries themselves.
Okay, I'm going to have to be rude and cut you off, Jane, but any questions, please talk to Jane later. It's just that we've got 3 more presentations in a very short time, and no, I didn't just give it to you, Stephen, because we're in the same place.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Jane. So as I said earlier, our next presentation is work that Julie and I have undertaken in Vanuatu this year, and unfortunately for us, Julie is not able to have a voice for us. So in July 2018, the Department of Pacific Affairs, in collaboration with Vanuatu's Employment Service Unit, undertook a demographic exercise of Ni Vanuatu for Australia's seasonal worker program and New Zealand's recognised seasonal employer program. So the rationale for the exercise was to determine what islands and villages were gaining access to these programs, and the information collected will be used to assist in determining future research on the impacts of labour mobility in the country. So some of the key research questions included where were the seasonal workers being recruited from, what areas were not being recruited from, and then using that information we were hoping that would help give us more ideas on research and looking into the challenges and opportunities for those communities that are actually missing out. And another question was, are there distinct patterns between where RSE and SWP workers are coming from? Because the rumours in Vanuatu, I don't know about in other countries, which we're hoping to extend this pilot project to, but in Vanuatu there's always gossip around SWP workers only coming from this island or RSE workers from another island. Also in the I was going to look at the difference in ages. We noted that SWP workers are ages of who are those who are selected younger, and that's actually an employer preference. But unfortunately we haven't fully brought out all the information to prove that one yet. And the other thing we were looking at was gender selection as well. So there are a lot of limitations. So basically our research findings, because we just did this in July and I rudely went on holiday in August. So our research and findings are still preliminary, and today we're just presenting the findings thus far. So Vanuatu has the largest number of combined workers in Australia and New Zealand, with an estimation of 7,000. The data collected at the time of the research was limited in scope, and that was due to the reliance on agents sending information to the ESU and a new database system that was established. And we're in deep gratitude to Eric Sako from ESU, who worked so hard to provide us the most up-to-date information at the time. So in total there were 2,992 workers on the database dating from June 2017 to 2018. And given that is less than half of the total workers going to both these schemes, it did make the demographic exercise more difficult to determine in overall numbers. However, it's still useful for the ESU and also for providing us future research considerations, especially when we're examining villages and islands that aren't accessing these schemes. It also assists the ESU to address the constant rumours of unfairness and opportunities to access these labour mobility schemes, and it provides information for Vanuatu's new upcoming labour mobility policies and domestic practices that intend on addressing inequalities to access in RSE and SWP and other potential labour agreements in the future that our Internal Minister has been looking at. So there were limitations to consider in this type of research, many of which I haven't actually put all of them in here. For example, we've got workers that were entered in twice, and it's not a mistake because some of them come on short 3-month contracts. So we also had workers that have the same name. Quite often the relative has the same name as you, so we had to use passports to identify the different workers, and also some workers that may have worked in RSE and SWP, and there's a 1-year period. So passports were our main form of identifying those workers. The most challenging and probably limiting aspect of the research was categorising where workers lived and where workers lived and where they identified from. Workers consulted prior to undertaking this research would identify with their island they were born on and not necessarily their current residence or vice versa. However, there are distinguished columns for current residents and their home islands on the database system, but that wasn't necessarily utilised by all recruitment agents. Therefore, often workers' villages and islands weren't recorded. So, as Table 1 shows, 19.5% of the sample had actually not recorded any village, and 5% didn't even record an island. The percentage of non-recording is actually higher with SWP workers, who are recruited primarily by the preferred private sector agent model, whereas RSE worker selection is a mixture of that and direct recruitment by employers. Original organisation frameworks of the two labour schemes determine the recruitment models that are used in Vanuatu, and that's discussed in an upcoming report. Further investigation is required to understand why village and island information is not recorded, and the considerably higher level of SWP workers and agents not providing this information. Nonetheless, one agent who recruits over 1,000 workers to RSC, she told me it's just because it's too difficult to spell the village name or no one knows how to do it. So, but nonetheless, what does need to be highlighted is that information provided in the 2018 section of the database was actually more comprehensive than that of 2017. Demonstrating that the system of collecting this data is actually improving, which is due to information being requested both by the ESU and Australia and New Zealand. training of data collection through New Zealand's RSE Strengthening Partnership Program and Australia's Labour Mobility Assistance Program, who both provide support for Pacific Island sending nations, has significantly improved information collection practices of private sector agents, direct recruiters and Pacific labour sending units. So once all that initial data was removed of double entries and limited to only workers that identified with islands, the figure dropped down to 2,511 workers, and it was broken down to provincial and island provinces. And I do apologise, we had the Department of Lands that were going to give us a nice map so we can put all the workers on, but they didn't follow through, unfortunately. So we've got 6 provinces in Vanuatu, and on this column here is the percentage of the population that are sending workers. So an unexpected discovery was the number of workers that were being sent from the smallest and most distinct area of the Torba province. So that's right at the top, up there, who send the largest number of workers per head of population statistics. But in terms of numbers, the numbers of workers sent from islands, the top 5 in order. Largest numbers are Awhate, which is a capital city, 442, Tana 388, Santo 269, Malakula 237 and Ambrim 165. And those numbers aren't surprising given that Tana and Ambrim were part of the World Bank pilot project in New Zealand 2006. Per head of population, the 5 top 5 sending islands are Muriulava at 13.7%, Tongawa, which is 9.6%, and Moso and Pali Islands 6.3%, and Motolava 5%. So with the exception of Motolava, those islands have a population of less than 1,000. Sorry, that was all the islands, it wasn't meant to be there. Okay, so we looked at gender statistics for islands sending more than 15 women, because quite often we have a lot of islands in Vanuatu, so there's a lot of islands sending. So we chose it for anyone over 15. Ambai, 37.5% of the female were sent, and then we've got Awhate 19%, Tana 9.5%, Ambrim and 9%, and Santo 7.5%. There were other larger sending islands that did not record any females participating in the scheme, such as Epi, but that may be due to our limited number of workers captured in the study. So, even so, from previous experience on Ambrim, there are various perceptions and restrictions on allowing women to participate in the schemes in Vanuatu. However, as we've noted, numbers have been increasing every year. That just jumped in there. So another interesting fact that we found was that more people from the island of Ambai were recruited in this period. And I don't know if many of you have heard the news about Ambai. Ambai had a total evacuation this year due to the Monaro volcano. So although we haven't researched this thoroughly, we would hypothesise that it's due to employers and recruiters targeting this area. I only talked to one recruiter who agreed with this at this stage. And so, as we've argued in the past, these schemes are an avenue for people to earn money to assist in relocating, rebuilding and other aspects of natural disasters, such as purchasing land. For the people of Ambai going to other islands, they'll have to be paying customary payments to the landowners, etc. So with this information, we're hoping to speak with employers and recruitment agents of these workers to further explore the research possibilities of why they targeted this area, and if they did. Okay, so even though this data has not captured every participating worker in the 2017 period to 18 period, it's allowed us to recognise the lack of data provided and build on this to create stronger information sharing. Nonetheless, even if we were to triple the number of workers to reflect our current numbers in the scheme, there is possibly a similar pattern, and we'll repeat this exercise again in July 2019, funding dependent. But we're also hoping to take it to other islands. I've had people in Tonga inquiring about it too. But what the data has actually revealed is that RSE and SWP schemes are actually reaching rural Vanuatu. Further research is essential to capture and assess if the more remote villages of these islands are gaining access, and information to these labour mobility opportunities, and also the gender dynamics of this, which the next round of information collection should highlight further. Nonetheless, our analysis is still preliminary, and like the question of recruitment on Ambi, more questions will arise from this data collection. Thank you. I'll take one question and then lead into Stephen because we are really running short for time with the late start. Any questions? No questions?
That's a good question.
Yes.
What happens for people that have gone from an area where they're going to have to be relocated? You've had volcanic activity, but you're also going to have climate change.
Yep.
That's going to... you're going to have climate change that's going to mean that populations will have to shift. So what's going to happen in that situation in terms of people wanting to relocate and potentially relocate to Australia, for example?
Okay. So I haven't been looking at in terms of relocating to Australia, and none of my seasonal workers are even participating. People in Vanuatu have been relocating before the schemes due to climatic issues. However, they are now using the scheme as ways to move their villages in different places, and especially in the case of Cyclone Pam, just about all of my SWP participants all mentioned we're rebuilding after Cyclone Pam. So that's one fabulous way that these schemes can contribute to helping out in the Pacific during times of natural disasters. But I'd rather put on to Stephen now because we want to hear from him. Thank you.
Just one sec. Mistake. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much to the opportunity to present. Labour mobility is a subject we do a lot of work on at the Development Policy Centre, and we work closely with the department and with both departments, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Pacific Affairs. And yeah, Rochelle does a lot of really great work at the micro level, and I think our sort of work at the more macro level really complements that, and I hope is informed by it. So this is some work I've been doing with Richard Curtin, and actually Richard was actually going to present this, but he's in Vanuatu doing some work on labour mobility, so I'm presenting it today. And what we're interested in are these objectives. One, just to understand how Pacific Island countries govern their participation in the seasonal worker program in RSE, because while they are mainly private sector driven programs, there is an inescapable role for government, and every government has rules around the scheme. So how do those rules differ? And then B, we want to explain why there's such a difference in participation between sending countries, which I'll show you there is. And we in particular want to see if we can, if this difference in participation is linked to governance. Do countries, if they govern the program better, get a return in terms of higher participation? And that's an interesting research question, and also has some strong policy implications. I want to stress it's work in progress, and we're still doing the research, and we very much welcome your feedback. But just to give you a sense, the two schemes, this is how they've grown over the last decade, and they've gone from 6,000 to 18,000, so they've tripled. And as you can see, it's pretty rapid growth. They're going to keep growing. So these schemes are now pretty important, and it's important we dig in further and understand, go beyond these aggregate numbers to this subject. So I'm going to go with that second objective. So I'm going to start off with the participation rates and just show you some of the huge differences that we need to try to explain. So the crudest way to measure these differences is in just in terms of total numbers, right? This is the combined Australia and New Zealand, and you see Vanuatu is way out in front, and then Tonga, and then Samoa, Timor, Solomons, Kiribati, Fiji, and so on. That's a start, but we should at least control for population. And so if we divide the number of seasonal workers by population, and here I use the restricted group. There are age limits on the two schemes. It's about 20 to 40. So in that age range, yeah, you see it's quite remarkable. Tonga at 14% of everyone in that age group every year comes to Australia or New Zealand to pick fruit. It's pretty much the same order. Tonga, Vanuatu at the top, Samoa, Tuvalu, Kiribati, But these, I guess my point is these differences are large, right? But these differences are super large, right? It's like from 14% with Tonga to 0.0% with Papua New Guinea, right? So there are massive, massive differences, especially once we control for population size. So there's a lot we can learn. We can learn from those countries that have really succeeded. So Tonga and Vanuatu are the two success stories. You can see they've both grown really strongly over time. There are some interesting differences with Vanuatu in front, then Tonga catching up with its success in Australia, but now Vanuatu pulling ahead again. But basically these are two successful countries versus Richard's done a discussion paper on PNG and why it's found it so hard. You can see there is some growth in PNG, but in absolute size, right, it's really bumping along the bottom. Right? PNG hasn't been able to take off in terms of participation. But we can also learn from differences within the smaller countries, and some of them have done much better than others. And you can see from this is just the seasonal worker program, but look at Timor-Leste, right? That's really seems to be taking off now, and it's taken third place in the seasonal worker program, getting ahead of Samoa. It's also of interest to compare Australia versus New Zealand. Why does Samoa send so many more workers to New Zealand than Australia? And so does Solomon Islands. What's going on there? So there's a lot to explain, and we can only make a start. What are the sort of factors that might explain these differences? We're going to focus on sending country governance, but that's only one factor. What are the broader range of factors that might explain these differences? So obviously one is other employment opportunities at home and abroad. So one reason people say Nauru hasn't participated more is that they're pretty much at full employment. With the processing centre there, why would you then go overseas? Likewise, the compact countries, although they're eligible for the seasonal worker program, they can already go to the United States, right? Why would they bother coming to Australia? Then relative distance and expense and the structure of the economy. People talk about Kiribati being disadvantaged by its distance, therefore the expense, and also by not having a strong agricultural sector. Broader internal challenges, when we're thinking of PNG, even if PNG had first-rate sending country governance, it's also an expensive place in which to do business, and it's sometimes a violent place, so a difficult place to recruit, so you can't totally isolate these schemes from the broader economy. Then we have diaspora and other first mover advantages. So if you get in first, you're definitely going to get an advantage. I just want to spend a minute on that because it is important, but I also want to make the point it's like history is not destiny. So if we look at New Zealand, you do get, in fact, that message, well, history is destiny. It's like the schemes there, the shares in New Zealand are very stable, right? Vanuatu for the last 6 years, around 46%, Tonga around a quarter, slightly down, and Samoa just under 20%. That makes it look like it's very hard for other countries to break in. But if you look at Australia, you get a totally different story. Right? And you see that 6 years ago, the scheme was very much dominated by Tonga. Tonga sent 80% of the workers, but that share is now down to 33%. And a large chunk of that has gone to Vanuatu. So Vanuatu, despite Tonga having that first mover advantage, hasn't been able to sustain it. And particular Vanuatu, but also other smaller countries have been able to take up the slack and fill the expansion. So I just want to make that point that first mover advantages matter, but they're not everything. Likewise, there's no doubt late joining disadvantage also matters. So Fiji, has been disadvantaged because it was only allowed into the scheme fairly recently. And finally, there's worker performance. That's a sensitive issue. I'm not going to rate countries. I know employers do. But I think, we could definitely say that Tonga has recently got a reputation for having a problem with workers absconding in Australia. And that has meant workers from Tonga aren't growing, whereas employers are turning to Vanuatu. So these are a range of factors. Sure, they're all important, but what we want to argue is that sending country governance is one of the factors that's also important in determining participation. It's probably the one factor that is most under a government's control, right? The others are very hard for them to deal with. And also might lie behind this, in particular, worker performance. So let me now go to the second part of the presentation, what are the differences? This is just to start off descriptively and then try and link those differences to participation. So this is where we've done the research, and here we've done, Richard's done country studies, 5. It sounds impressive, but we haven't done the 2 big ones, right, of Vanuatu and Tonga. But Richard is in Vanuatu today, so we're trying to complete the list. And we've also had lots of discussions with employers and other stakeholders. So what do we mean by labour mobility governance? It's all the arrangements around the actual work, right? It's the structures put in place around the work. And there are different ways you can cut it up, but one way we've thought is recruitment, clearance, and everything else. So recruitment, you need the employer to select the employee, right? Without that, there's no work. But then you also need clearance, right? The government has, the sending country government also has to clear workers. There are these official MOUs with Australia, so the government can't have, even if it wants to, it can't be completely hands-off when it comes to the selection process. And then there's a whole range of things which are the scheme can happen without them, so they're not mandatory, unlike the first 2, but they're things that governments tend to get involved with, and for good reason. So promotion, you want people to know that your country can provide workers. And then all sorts of facilitation, from pre-departure briefing, to helping with visas from Australia, pastoral care, and then problem shooting, when problems crop up, either in Australia or in New Zealand, I should say. So governance doesn't mean government, right? A lot of these roles are done by the private sector. Governance means the arrangements around the actual work. All right, so we'll just go through these 3, and mainly on recruitment, because I think that's the most important. So all countries maintain a work-ready pool from which employers can recruit workers. But most countries allow employers and or agents to recruit workers directly from outside the work-ready pool, right? So the work-ready pool is not compulsory. The exceptions to this are Timor-Leste and PNG, where it's strongly discouraged, right? So you really have to go through that pool. Kiribati and Samoa allow employer-agent recruitment, but prefer that some employers use the work-ready pool. Other countries let the employer choose. And when I say choose, some countries allow agents, who are domestic intermediaries, Kiribati, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, as well as employer-direct recruitment, where the employer goes to the country themselves to recruit. But some countries allow direct recruitment, but not agents, in particular Fiji and Tonga. So I think one thing we can say straight away is that those countries that give a work-ready pool a monopoly position do worse, right? You don't want to set up a monopoly with a work-ready pool. And if we look at PNG and Timor, even though Timor succeeded, it's still very small compared to Vanuatu and Tonga. And I've just put up these 2 quotes. I mean, just to show you, PNG is really funneling everyone through that work-ready pool, and whereas Tonga is, much more relaxed about how the employer wants to go about it. And, this makes sense. This is a finding that is sort of intuitive, right? You don't want to set up a monopoly. The government may not run the work-ready pool efficiently. And if we look at why Timor's done better than PNG, the work-ready pool in PNG just hasn't been run very efficiently. It's difficult for the employer to contact the people in charge of the work-ready pool. It hasn't been set up well. But we know monopolies lead to corruption. You start to get bribes to have to join the pool, so you want to give workers alternative avenues. But also this very important thing, employers want workers they can trust. Right? They're taking them out for 6 months, they're incurring lots of costs. If things go wrong, it's even more costly. So they want employers they can trust, and that means they either want return workers or they want people recommended by return workers, right? Because a friend of a friend is a friend, kind of thing. So if you have to always go back to the work-ready pool, okay, you can use return workers, but one thing, people drop out over time. They don't come back year after year. Plus you may expand, right? So you can't simply rely on the return workers. Then you want to rely on the friends of the return workers, the people recommended by return workers. But if they have to get to the work-ready pool, well, they may not be able to, right? So you're not allowing that advantage of trust to develop. That said, the work-ready pool is still important because it's where you start. And some of our findings are don't fill up the work-ready pool from urban settlements, especially if it's horticultural. And also Fiji's been using community selection to select those initial workers in the work-ready pool. It seems to have worked well. I'm going to skip over a few things. especially about the return worker phenomenon, which I'm happy to take questions about. I'm running out of time. Just to go into clearance, as I said, you can't get rid of the government function. The Australian government requires police checks, health checks. Governments have to do this or delegate it, but then they have to sign off on it. And it has to be administered efficiently. And I think it's a tribute to Vanuatu that they seem to have got these tasks down, and they're trusted by employers to do them promptly. Finally, on promotion and facilitation, I think one reason for Timor's growth, it has given a lot of attention to this issue. It's it was the first country to have an in-country Australia labour attaché. Tonga now has one as well. But in general, our advice to Pacific countries is to invest in the scheme in Australia and in New Zealand for those promotion and facilitation roles. Agents can also play a role in promotion, but this can be counterproductive. So one thing you might have heard from Vanuatu, Vanuatu has allowed agents, but recently it's sort of liberalised the number of agents and now has more than 90 agents. So twice as many agents as improved employers. And in fact, this number's further increased, I'm told. And you commonly now hear from employers, we're always hearing from Vanuatu agents trying to sell us workers. So you have to be careful of the kind of harassment factor. And the last point we'd make is that promotion can't be seen as external to your performance. The best way to promote the scheme is to have a good track record. These are the conclusions. Pacific Island participation in the two schemes varies enormously across sending countries. Sending country labour mobility governance arrangements are by no means the only factor, but they do seem to be an important explanatory factor for participation. I think there's no single model, right? Like this is a template for success, but countries can learn from each other. And one of the promising features we see in the debate is countries that have missed out, like PNG, are starting to debate, well, why haven't we got more workers? What do we need to do that other countries can do? And since I'm out of time, I'll go over the... Am I out of time? Yes, I'm out of time. So I won't go over the policy recommendations. I'll just leave you with these two sort of broad messages. We distinguish between governance in the broad sense and governance in the narrow sense. So governance in the broad sense is the structure of the scheme. And that really matters, obviously. And our key message here is that governments need to provide scope for trusted intermediaries to emerge. So it's somehow finding a balance between forcing everyone through the work ready pool, that doesn't allow trusted intermediaries, and on the other extreme, complete liberalisation, where anyone can set up as an agent, where you have the risk of sort of one-shot games and exploitation in the short term. So having somewhere in the middle, a kind of regulated market seems to be the balance that you need to strike. And then governance in the narrow sense is also important. This is just how well the government does its role of administering the scheme, right? As against the broader governance arrangements. And the key message here is that efficient administration, but also high-level political leadership is critical for success. I'm happy to talk more about specific recommendations and further research questions, but I will leave it here, and I'll just say that if you're interested in labour mobility, look out for our blog, devpolicy.org, and sign up for our monthly Pacific Labour Mobility newsletter. Thank you.
You did so well. You've got 2 minutes of question time. Anyone got any questions for Stephen?
Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you, Sakias from the PNG High Commission. Let me thank ANU and DFAT and for organizing this event. This is a very important event for the Pacific. We've got unemployment and other challenges, and I see this as an opportunity or way of Australia and New Zealand opening up and embracing the Pacific. And for PNG, of course, thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. I think it's always not good when your country's at the bottom, but I think that's a challenge for me as Acting High Commissioner to really see how we can improve our systems. And of course, good examples from Vanuatu in terms of the ranking, in terms of the various recruitments and numbers from provinces. I think I want to know how you do that. And for PNG, of course, we want to, we've got issues there in terms of, we want to see political leadership. I think there was debate in Parliament, in the floor of Parliament, that PNG is not doing well. I think there is concerns out there from the political leaders as well as the general public, PNG general public, that they want to participate in this process. But I guess that kind of, in a way, gives the wrong impression that the opportunities are not there, and it is there. And it is under the MOE, under the seasonal workers program that covers for PNG, and we've also have that element included in the MOU between Queensland and PNG. And so I think it's up to us to really step up and see how we can improve, and how to really get the issues sorted out, and getting the different modalities and in terms of moving forward. So I would be very much interested in your recommendation for PNG and how we can collaborate and see how we can improve the situation. So that's something that I want to really discuss with you further, in terms of maybe going up to Port Moresby and have a meeting with the guys up there, or getting them down here and really sort it out, because I really want to see the numbers increase. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We might leave it with that. Do you have a comment for a reply, Wesley?
Yeah, I think thank you very much, High Commissioner. Appreciate your attendance and interest. And yeah, my advice, I think the first thing I'd say is, there are no quotas, right? So there are no quotas between countries. So it is competition. Pacific countries are competing with each other. But there are competition means there are opportunities. And I think especially if you look at the Australian scheme, the red one, it really is growing. And when a scheme's growing, that means there's opportunities. And we need PNG. We need the bigger countries to really step up, because how many workers can Tonga send? We've seen that Tonga's actually already flattened. We know in Vanuatu, they've run into some problems with their number of agents. So we really need to diversify this, not just for PNG's sake, but for the Pacific's sake. And we know there are calls in Australia to introduce a new agricultural visa, which will be open to Asia. And that's a very live issue that the Nationals are pushing. And if that happens, that will really take away the market from all the Pacific countries. So we need the bigger countries, PNG and Solomons, to really step up. And how PNG can do that, I would say two things. One, it is such a big country, you don't want to monopolise through a single work-ready pool. You want to allow a variety of trusted intermediaries to develop. So you need to take a much more decentralised approach. That's one. And the second would be on political leadership. Yeah, I would say now you've got APEC. It's going to be over soon. Take the people, because you put the best people in charge of APEC, take them, put them in charge of the labour mobility scheme.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Also, if I can add to that, after working with Horticulture New Zealand for many years, we've actually been encouraging employers to stop looking at Tonga and taking so many from Tonga and Vanuatu and sharing the wealth around the Pacific. So it is actively being worked on by employers themselves as well. Okay, so for our last presentation, so for the last 11 years now, should I say, I've been doing a longevity study of RSE workers. So kia ora, we're heading to New Zealand now. Since the initiation of the RSE scheme, it's been closely monitored by government, academics and many others to assess the overall impacts of the scheme, mainly for growers, but also for workers as well. Now, two of the main objectives of the RSE right at the beginning was to address the needs of New Zealand's horticulture and viticulture industries, as well as encourage economic development for the Pacific Island nations. And in 2009, I actually argued that the RSE had met its objectives for the industries and one day might find itself to be, as Tanya Bassett said for the Canadian worker scheme, a structural necessity rather than a preferred or convenient type of labour for employers in these industries. And by 2014, I argued this is the case. As Stephen Darling, one of the employers in New Zealand, said, we're really dependent on RSE workers in these schemes, and if we're going to expand our industries in Central Otago, we need to expand the RSE scheme, and actually New Zealanders' jobs are actually dependent on it. The Stevens comments have resonated throughout many employees in the scheme. In regards to development for Vanuatu, there are many different levels that can be analysed, how the RSE has impacted national economies, community development, and individual households, which is actually a term I'm not comfortable with in Vanuatu. As I've argued throughout my PhD research, RSE workers are never restricted to the household level. Their incomes are redistributed through our custom ceremonies, fundraisers, and other social networks, contributing to a number of non-participating households. Given that development itself is a loaded and ambiguous term, I actually prefer the term self-development, where workers and their families express what they term as development, and that's not necessarily the prescribed objectives that labour mobility stakeholders, both in New Zealand and Australia, advocate for. For example, like creating new businesses. As Dame Meek mentioned earlier, there's that imported ideas of development. Self-development can be seen as anything as simple as decorating a house or building a house. Actually, if a survey was to be conducted on all workers, you will find the two most important factors have been building a house or paying for education. And a study on that alone is evidence that these schemes are making a difference to ideas of development. So some of the most significant changes, of course, in New Zealand, 2007 we started with 5,000. We're now over 11,000. But the most significant was the joint ATR, which enables RSE-approved employers to share workers throughout their period of visas. And prior to this change, when employers could not provide work for RSEs, they could not place them elsewhere. And that's a concern given workers still have financial obligations, such as accommodation, travel, insurance, and commitments to home to pay for. Although the joint ATR is more beneficial for employers, it does contribute to combating workers being out of pocket and there are significant downtimes, which can cause vulnerability and health into the well-being of workers when they're here. So joint ATRs increase the numbers of RSE workers, providing smaller businesses the opportunity to participate in RSE. Whereas before the joint ATR, a single approved employer had to provide a large amount of hours for an RSE worker, and that was difficult for a smaller grower. The second one would be the RSE Strengthening Partnership Program. So it's been instrumental in building and strengthening relationships with Pacific labour sending countries, and it's also undergone its own evaluations. And the most recent said that not only does it strengthen Pacific Island countries' capacity to administer the RSE and wider labour exports, it scopes in-country opportunities for horticulture skills demand, it improves PIC process for wider export, it's assessing the impacts of the RSE in the Pacific and facilitating opportunities for labour mobility in the fisheries and Canterbury trades. By looking at these objectives, it's clear that SPP is constantly reflecting on the needs of that of the Pacific and future employment opportunities in New Zealand. And from personal conversations with Pacific Labour Sending Unit representatives, they have noted the value of SPP and highlighted the positive results that have come from this initiative. Furthermore, the SPP team have also got good relationships with New Zealand employers, improving links between employers and government and employers and Pacific Labour Sending governments, which is essential. The third one that I've also focused on is the Whakamiasina. In 2009, New Zealand introduced an RSE pilot training program, and that was replaced with the current Whakamiasina. It's delivered by Fruition Horticulture, and it provides online and in-person training programs to assist RSE workers in developing increased forms of literacy, such as English language, financial and computer literacy, as well as many other trainings. The trainings are designed with the hopes that it will not only assist workers living in New Zealand, but also contribute to new skills to be taken home. In my own evaluation of Whakamiasina in 2014, I argued that the Whakamiasina coordinators actually took their training scheme further. It's not just a simple literacy training program, they do practical skills. For example, they realised that workers were taking home chainsaws, not knowing how to use them. They teamed up with Mitre 10 in New Zealand and put on training programs for RSE workers to safely use these chainsaws back home. And another thing about the Whakamiasina program is they work with the RSE workers. They don't say, these are the skills you need, they say, what do you want to learn? So it's really nice to hear that workers get to have a say in these programs. The three significant changes for the Vanuatu Department of Labour was the introduction of the Seasonal Employment Act number 23, the alcohol ban in 2009, and the increased use of private sector agents that Stephen talks about. However, I must say that it's mainly used for SWP more so than ROC. Okay. So the alcohol ban was a decision made for a number of reasons. Two most important were all the problems were stemming from workers drinking, and Vanuatu wanted to be seen as the only Pacific Island country that had this rule to make their workers appear to be better for employers. But it's been difficult for New Zealand employers to deal with because it's not against our laws in New Zealand for those workers to be drinking. So it has been difficult to manage. However, in March 2018, Vanuatu also hosted its first Labour Mobility Summit in response to the increasing numbers of workers in Australia and New Zealand. And there has been a call for a national labour mobility policy, which is a timely and innovative step that the current government are undertaking. However, this paper is based on a case study of 22 men, of which 20 have been involved in a 10-year longevity project. 2, unfortunately, are deceased. Since October 2007, I examined various impacts, participation in cross-border labour mobility. And prior to 2007, Vanuatu actually sent 45 workers to New Zealand for a pilot project, the Seasonal Solutions Cooperative, and 11 of my participants participated in that World Bank study in 2006, and currently 3 of them are still working here. So we have had some changes. Changes in recruitment. Initially, our recruitment was done through community-based. It was done through the Lollyhore Development Council. However, there were issues with that, which I'm not going to go into today. And now it's direct recruitment by the employer, and the employer actually hired an in-country manager for that. So the first season, one of the many companies I work with, Seasonal Solutions, we started with 232 workers, and this year we've got nearly 2,000 workers from Vanuatu. However, the next few slides are the main issues that workers and employers have had to address and always constantly highlight to me. And although I've addressed this in previous papers, I really want to highlight two to this list that Australia and New Zealand really need to take more care of. One of them is suitable accommodation. It's still a real problem. And the other one is transportation to and from work sites, and the question of how much workers should be charged. And I think that needs further monitoring by both governments to prevent any exploitation for any employers or agents that try to make a buck with these seasonal workers. As said earlier, there's a lot of responsibilities for employers. For employers, it's actually not advantageous to participate in the RSC given the various pastoral care obligations which are not required with other seasonal workers. Nonetheless, the majority say that costs outweigh the benefits. And in terms of pastoral care, having those returned workers makes it so much easier for employers. Health and wellbeing is definitely a main issue, and that's where the suitable accommodation comes again. Justifying overcrowding by stating that's how they live in the Pacific is really unacceptable. And I've heard it in the forums. I heard it in the Vanuatu forum. We've got 8 people to a room, and the room is probably half the size of, not even quarter the size of this. So as I said to you, that really needs a lot more attention. And it is difficult for employers to find suitable accommodation. Workers also try to save a lot of money. So quite often we've got workers who will be buying $1 packet of chips, a bread for $1, and a fizzy drink for $1, and that's their daily meal. And a lot of employers and communities have actually noticed that their workers are doing this, and have actually banded together and built gardens for a lot of workers. So a lot of employer and community involvement over the years has helped. And even the Hawke's Bay District Council noted issues with health and the RSC scheme, and they developed a health toolkit for RSC workers that actually shows pictures of things to look out for, because we were seeing huge amount of boils occurring due to the way that people were eating. So overcoming concerns, understanding deductions is still one of the main problems. And New Zealand and Australia have done everything that they can through those pre-departure trainings, and it is difficult. The workers are taking on a lot of information before they come to New Zealand and Australia. But we've also seen the increased participation of unions to assist workers. Thank you. And this. And one of my favourite quotes in 2007, when workers are looking at their deductions, see this thing called tax, I don't want to pay it anymore. So there isn't, even though they're taught this at pre-departure sessions, it's not necessarily sitting in. However, one of the changes to the RSE, and submitting tax returns for hundreds of seasonal workers a year was a nightmare for this company for the first year. So they did lobby for a tax change to RSE, which happened in 2008, which was reduced down to 10.5 for seasonal workers in 2011. And there's also the cost of remitting money. That's a barrier actually to send money home. And there is the access to Send Money Pacific, as Matt and I talked about the other day. It's a great initiative, but more often than not, many workers don't actually have access to anything but Western Union in the communities that they work in. Okay, so quickly, my long-term workers, I've still got nine participating, so 9 out of the 20 are still participating in RSE and have not had a break. One switched over to the SWP after he was told not to come back to RSE, and 10 in Vanuatu. So when I talk to the workers over the Christmas break, do you think you'll stop? No, it's my job, I love it. Ron said maybe I'll stop in 2020, but Ron told me that in 2012 as well, that he was stopping. I need to continue paying for school fees. The job needs to continue so I can help my community. It's my work now, I'm happy. School fees again, these are the constant reasons why workers stay in there. So the reasons that they even go are the reasons that they keep coming back to. So in regards to development, my argument still stands. The main objective of development drawn out by participants has been education, housing and community engagement. 95% of my participants have paid for school fees, and an interesting one that's always come out, considering there's only 20 workers in this small group, the startup funds, 32% have contributed to startup funds for other people's businesses. Okay, so life without the RSE, for the workers that have stopped. Some of them have reached their goals, some of them have done it for their family, and some have done it because of disappointing outcomes. So as part of my research, I've documented, not just those that participate, but those that don't participate. But I think it's really important to look at those who stop. Do they keep achieving what they want to go, or are they going to be like Luke, who says to me, I need to come back, I've got more school fees to pay for. And also being blacklisted is another reason for not coming back. 5 of my workers have been blacklisted for drinking alcohol. For Vanuatu in total, there's 106 on the ban list and 1,300 on the standing and down list. And as I said, an issue that's happening now is workers are actually jumping from one scheme to another because they're not necessarily being reported when they've been asked not to come back. One of the main things that I see is how with the RSE with the employers, it's gone from paternalism to partnership. And as one of the employers said at a community meeting in Ambrym, this is a partnership between our company and your communities. The more our company grows, the more workers we'll take from the community. So there's new relationships being built up through the work. This still is an area that really we all talk about reintegration, but it's such a difficult and complex space with so many considerations. A first-time worker may not know what to do with his money, or a second-time worker, you just don't know what stage that they're at, and it depends on circumstances. I had a worker give me an envelope of 10,000 New Zealand dollars and said, what do I do with it? So we still need to have systems of support, but it has to be country specific, and maybe it even has to be 3rd year, 4th year specific. So there's a whole lot of questions of reintegration. Sorry. Okay, so some of the lessons learned. Sorry, I'm going so fast. Communication and constant dialogue between stakeholders is totally necessary, and it strengthens the overall success and has created mutual benefits. pastoral care, and it's not a go at New Zealand and Australian governments, it really needs to always be assessed. And so is looking at the broader impacts for long-term participation. As said earlier, I think we really need to document these relationships between employers and workers. The employers I work with, they've got to build medical centres, schools, all sorts of things that are happening that are not documented. And as we discussed earlier, the response to natural disasters. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. We have time for 2 questions. I've been presenting them, right? I'm going to leave this. Any questions?
Just a brief question. Thanks very much for the interesting presentation. In the process of selection and over the years, it's linked to Stephen's presentation earlier in relation to the different countries. There's a competition there between countries and employers and agents and so forth. So in terms of the country profiling and how employers and countries themselves have profiled countries in terms of efficiency, the kind of subtle, if you like, subtle biases which may impact on how they choose. How does it come into play?
That is exactly what's happening. Is employers set themselves up with a particular community, and they usually stick with that community because they build relationships with that community. However, as I said, the employer that I do work with is very large, and as from about 3 RSC conferences ago, when they were told to look elsewhere, it is actually happening. Employers are actually looking to other countries and other communities. So even though it can be an advantage, it could be a disadvantage if an employer gets into trouble with a community. We have had an example of where an employer ignored a community leader when it came to recruitment, and then the community leader wouldn't even take anyone from his community. Anyone else before we wrap it up? No other questions? One more.
Sorry, and it may be a question that actually links back into Jane too. The importance of that ability for employer or for a person to be able to move from one employer to another is a characteristic of the RSC, but isn't currently in the Australian. How vital was that? And is there any thought about that in the Australian scheme? Any lessons from that?
I think it's, for me, I think it's completely vital, and that's why I push for it, but I can't answer for the Australian government. I think there's some arrangements that do occur though, but I can't answer. Actually, even jobs might be able to answer that.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, I'm Doug from Department of Jobs and Small Business. So we do allow it in exceptional circumstances. And generally if, for example, there's like a natural disaster it may completely wipe out an area, and employers are willing to voluntarily release those workers to have them be hosted by another employer. The work is quite considerable in those types of circumstances, so we do do it on a very, very rare basis. So instead what we do is we encourage approved employers to use what we call contingency planning, which is to ensure that there's an ongoing amount of work even during downtimes in the season. So an employer is required to outline who else they may be able to approach in the region or in the state to supply work to workers, but they will still maintain oversight as the employer and maintain the pay arrangements and ensure the workers' pastoral care is being
Okay, can I just get everyone to do their thing, gratitude for my panellists, please?